Hi, everybody. So this presentation is called Nondual Therapy That Works. And my name is Michael Leiden. I'm a certified realization process senior practitioner, as well as a certified practitioner of a psychotherapy method called Coherence Therapy, which is also used in therapy-informed coaching. So just a little bit about me. I specialize in helping spiritually oriented adults permanently shift out of self-limiting patterns. And that's ranging from trauma-based imprints to deeply held beliefs that mimic the types of self-limiting patterns that we get from trauma. And the methods that I employ are non-dual techniques that help people get to a level of their being that is beyond what, let's say, the normal range of self-help or psychology techniques can do, and getting to a level of their own being that feels like it was never wounded in that which can't be wounded. Now, sometimes we call this pure consciousness, sometimes self with a capital S, the ground of our being, as it's been called in the Christian schools. And it's a real palpable experience that we can have that helps us find a depth of being that is beneath fragmentation and loneliness and isolation. And for that reason, it helps us feel a very deep sense of resourcing and connectedness and kind of a self-other oneness, right? A self-other, self-environment, self-world, self-divine oneness. And another aspect of the way that I work with people is helping to guide and trigger a type of neuroplasticity that's not just learning something new, but unlearning something that's deeply entrenched. And this process is called memory reconsolidation. It's the brain's natural capacity for unlearning long-term emotional suffering patterns and core beliefs. So we're going to get into what that is in this presentation, or at least how to do it. There's a section that we're going to go through that talk about, that ask the question, is there a cheat code to deconditioning, to the process of deconditioning that exists in whether it's transformative coaching or therapy-informed coaching, or a contemplative kind of inquiry-based practice that gets at that level of depth, right? Is there a core process to that? And I think the answer is yes. This core process is explored actually in this book called Unlocking the Emotional Brain by Bruce Ecker, Robin Tichich, and Laurel Hulley. And actually, there's a new edition that's coming out around April 2024, in which I've contributed a chapter. So if you want to check that out, it'll be available on Amazon or your local bookstore that sells psychology books. So just a little bit about my background. I do therapy-informed coaching, which just means that the focus is on solving problems versus diagnosing illnesses, because a lot of trauma-based imprints are just the mind-body system working as it should. It's not actually a psychiatric illness of any sort. It's just a normative range of responses to life that we have when we go through painful experiences. And so we can use psychotherapy techniques in a way where the purpose is to help resolve those kinds of life problems. And so that's what therapy-informed coaching is. And I've been trained by Bruce Ecker, who's the co-founder of Coherence Therapy, and who is part of the cohort that teaches people coherence therapy or coherence coaching. And I also am certified in a somatic meditation method called the realization process as a senior level teacher. And I was trained by Judith Blackstone, who was also the founder of that method. My key focus is working with individuals and groups via Zoom and in the Boston North Shore area, and bringing over 15 years of experience in these and other methodologies for helping people find that fundamental level of well-being, as well as transforming their consciousness. And I also sometimes do assistant teaching within realization process online certification trainings. So I've got, I guess my client base as a client base, people that I normally work with are what I would refer to as spiritually oriented adults, meaning that they're interested in a deeper experience of inner peace, relationship with divinity. They want to find their true self, the ground of being, source consciousness, Buddha nature. Basically, a steady state level of stillness and fundamental well-being that is in the background of our experience already in some sense, but that it does take some effort to find it, right? To experience that and to stabilize it little by little, and to resolve what you could say are samskaras or self-limiting patterns or trauma-based imprints, any and all the above. You know, the catch-all term in spirituality is conditioning, to resolve conditioning that holds us askew from that space. And another aspect of spiritually oriented adults is that there's a strong ethical core to them. Generally speaking, they're interested in self-knowledge and living an authentic, meaningful life. And so really that's, my clients are in that kind of, they all seem to share those values. And they're spiritually oriented adults that are looking to resolve self-limiting patterns. So I would define a self-limiting pattern as mental constraints upon our ability to feel comfortable in our own skin, to flourish and work in relationships, and otherwise to live our true potential. And these originate from a set of unconscious core beliefs based in early traumatic experiences or other powerful emotional learnings. And so even if it's not an early traumatic experience per se, sometimes there are learnings that are passed on from our parents that are their own kind of, you know, that maybe they came from a direct experience of some sort of pain or, you know, a traumatic experience that a parent had. And that same, you could say the echo of the emotional pain goes through the lineage line. You know, it goes from parent to child, even if the child, him or herself, doesn't hasn't been traumatized, let's say, directly, right? So if a parent experienced, let's say, sexual abuse and is really not in touch with their kind of more sensorial bodily sense of expression or faculties, and there's a real sense of there's a sense of dissociation there or something, the child might mirror that dissociation, right? It's like the echo of it again travels down the family line. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a kind of powerful emotional learning. And although it doesn't feel like a belief, right? Because like, let's say we pick up from a parent this, like if a parent was traumatized, and it's just to go off of this example, if we pick up from a parent that our sexuality is not safe, or the physical aspects of our being are really not safe, or they're dirty in some way, right? Sometimes we can pick up these learnings from religion also. If that belief is something that is just, it feels as if it's how the world is and everybody acts like that, then what that means is that the belief will be internalized on a nonverbal level. And that's why what I'm calling beliefs really don't feel like beliefs. They just feel like how reality is. It responds, it feels as if we're responding to how reality actually is and not a belief, right? So these beliefs, which don't feel like beliefs, they just feel like how reality is on this gut level of experience. Another example would be when somebody feels worthless. That's their inner emotional reality and experience of life. It's not a mental concept. It's not a quote unquote story, as a lot of the non-dual in the non-dual spirituality space, you know, we get this word story. It's not a very accurate word, in my opinion, because it's not, it doesn't live at that level of a concept or a narrative or a story that is in language. It lives at a more implicit, unconscious feeling level of being. Okay. And again, I'll be reiterating this through this presentation. It feels as if that is how life is. And we can resolve these underlying kind of feelings or core beliefs by bringing them into verbal awareness. And that's part of what we call an integration process, where this primal level of the mind gets integrated with the conscious part of the mind. And then it becomes a normal adult problem instead of something that's sort of hanging back in our unconscious mind. Okay. So, and we'll explore more as to how this works. So when we're talking about self-limiting patterns, the real gold standard of therapy, let's say therapy or therapy-informed coaching, when it works at its best, right? Of course, there's the sense of unconditional positive regard that the practitioner has with a client. There's acceptance. There's welcoming and deep compassion towards emotions that come up, towards experiences that the client has been through. Or if we're doing our own work, there's self-compassion there, and there has to be that. That's a necessary condition, although it's not sufficient. What is really necessary for a permanent shift, which I believe is the gold standard of what transformative therapy or coaching should do for a client. The gold standard is a permanent shift. And the permanent shift means that if, for example, the underlying feeling is low self-worth, then that low self-worth undergoes a permanent shift. At one point, the client feels as if they lack a fundamental sense of self-worth. At time two, after X amount of doing the work, they feel like, oh, that's not my baseline reality. I do feel fundamentally worthy. And they shift out of the more top level symptoms, such as depressed mood or procrastination, that ultimately have low self-worth as the underlying foundation, right? We could say that self-limiting patterns are like magic tricks, and they create suffering from this lower level. And the magician really lives in the unconscious mind, and the audience lives in the conscious mind. And both minds, you could say, really live in the same person. Once the magic trick, which is the domain of the magician, it's like once that magic trick is explained to the audience no longer is fooled by it, right? The way that so we could extend that analogy is to the unconscious conscious dynamic. Once the emotional reality of that underlying construct of worthlessness, once all of that becomes unpacked out of unconscious feeling level of awareness, and it opens into and is integrated with verbal conscious awareness, it becomes seen and experienced in a different way. Often all we have to do is integrate those underlying like feeling level presumptions or beliefs. All we have to do is integrate them into conscious awareness, often, maybe about 50% of the time. And 50% of the time, it requires a little more finessing, or a lot more, depending on how deep the trauma is, right? But the point is that even when there's integration, once this underlying dimension of the patterning is seen, it can't be unseen. Okay. For example, let's say that a client has low self-worth symptoms, and the question is posed, okay, if you experience that encounter the same way with mom and dad, the same exact way, the only difference is that you don't go into a pattern of thinking negatively about yourself. What happens, right? How does that feel to you? At first, it might be like, oh yeah, that would feel great, right? That's an answer that's coming from the logical conceptual mind, top level awareness. See if you can hold that a little bit longer, see what happens. Wow, oh, something about that doesn't feel comfortable. Yeah, something about that doesn't feel comfortable. It's like, if I don't go into that negative view of myself, wow, it's like, yeah, that's how mom and dad knew me. They knew me as this person that just couldn't get it right. But if I can actually get it right, and I am fundamentally okay, then they might never recognize me that way. So feeling recognized as this worthless person was actually better than no recognition at all, right? So I'm just giving one possible example of what that was. I'll just say this last thing on this slide, and then we'll move on. In some of the more cognitive approaches, there's the notion of low self-worth being a core belief. I would put it a little bit differently, that low self-worth is often that's not the core belief, right? Because there's a lower level to it. So it can be a red herring to say, oh, well, oh, I have low self-worth. Now let's bring in some, contradictory experience, some experiences that contradict this view of low self-worth. Can you think of some positive things about yourself? Right? Because what that will miss, or what it will try to bypass or override, is that deeper level of, what's holding that low self-worth together, right? There's often adjacent core beliefs, I guess, if you want to call them that. There's adjacent beliefs or feeling knowings about ourselves that hold it together, right? And you could say that, low self-worth sort of sits on top of those deeper core beliefs. So for example, like I just named, mom and dad might not know me. If I really am good and worthy and so on and so forth, then I will, I aligned with this view that I wasn't that good because that was the only way I could be known and accepted by mom and dad. It's sort of like a negative bonding, Um, but if I really allow myself to be to feel my own self-worth, my sense of worthiness or innate goodness, the types of experiences that we get to through non-dual meditation a lot of the time, if we really allow ourselves to experience that, then we'd have to go through the grief and the kind of the grief, other emotions, maybe anger, other emotions that might be lurking under the surface that are related to how mom and dad never really knew me for who I was, and just how just how tragic that is, and how awful that is to experience. And and then once those emotions move through, then it's like the shift can really consolidate a bit more, and it's like, okay, well, I guess that's just, that was what it was. And yeah, it's sad, but I can move on and I can experience myself as fundamentally good. If mom and dad weren't able to see that, it's because they were confused, and not because there's anything fundamentally wrong with me. It's just they couldn't see who I really was in their fog of confusion, right? So that's what the kind of resolution would look like on the tail end of it, for that specific kind of pattern, just as an example, right? There's many different reasons for which we might be parked in a low self-worth pattern, which I've explored in another video on low self-worth. But anyway, let's just move on here. Let's talk about spiritual awakening and transformative therapy as to what the common grounds are between these two different processes, because there are some schools of non-duality land which say that you really don't have to do, if you're doing therapy work, it's all the mind, and what we're trying to do is something that is beyond the mind, or we're trying to help get you to an experience that's beyond the normal range of the mind, which is where all the therapy stuff lives. And once you get there into non-dual territory, then just all the conditioning or all of the suffering will just sort of fall off of you. And it'll just you won't be affected by it anymore. I have never found that to be true. Even people who are very experienced meditators, or people who are I feel are reliable witnesses of their own. I believe them that they're reliable witnesses to their own experience, and they feel like they've gone through stable shifts into a different way of seeing the world, where there's not this implicit sense of self-other, the self-other fragmentation, or self-divinity fragmentation. They feel like they're at one with this sort of primordial force or level of reality that that permeates the universe and that is the universe, right? That generates both consciousness and our external perceptions of reality. The sense of inside and outside are, the gut level conceptual division between inside and outside dissolves, etc. So what are the common grounds between awakening and therapy? Because there are some. One thing that we could talk about here is a shift in our felt sense level of ontology. Okay, ontology is sort of it's that's a technical term a little bit, but it's an important term to know. I'm not going to have that many technical terms here, but ontology is one of them. Ontology means our essential, a view as to what the essence of something is, right? Ontology is ontology and metaphysics are similar things, right? Ontology is like, if we're making an ontological statement about something, we're making a statement about what the essence of that thing is. And we could talk about transformations that are non-dual in nature, where our essential level of being, or what we feel our ontology is, shifts. So we can go from having a divided sense of mind, where we feel like our thoughts and our perceptions are divided from our emotions, and our emotions are divided from our sensations. We can go to where all of that feels smooth and continuous, where we feel like we're a unified being. And that would be one version of an ontological shift, right? Another version of an ontological shift would be the ontological shift between, feeling like this kind of, division between self and other. It's ontological division between self and other. I feel like I'm over here. You feel like you're over there. Another shift would be into a kind of field or a space where there really is no division between self and other. Of course, our sensations arise here, that person's sensations arise over there, but everything emerges out of this one space of undifferentiated consciousness. And that's an ontological shift, right? That would be an ontological shift towards awakening. The shift that I mentioned earlier, where we feel internally, more cohesive, internally continuous sensations, emotions, and mental perceptions. That's the type of shift that happens in psychotherapy, and those are both ontological shifts. Okay, so ontological shifts would be shifts in the way we experience and relate to the world around us, shifts in our fundamental baseline perception of reality, and shifts in our fundamental beliefs, attitudes, and attachments. Those I would consider all of those ontological shifts. And the ones that we go through in awakening, it's a process that has to do with the core sense of separate self to no separate self. That's what the trajectory of awakening is like. That's what it consists of. So we go from this fragmented, isolated sense of self to a more unified sense of self, to a sense of self that feels maybe unified with the larger reality, or with a sense of fundamental dimension of consciousness. And there are, versions of awakening that are no self, right? Which means that the kind of basic subconscious energy that's beneath thinking, it's not a story of a self, it's not a concept of a self, but it's a kind of looping of energy that feels like it's within this kind of contracted sense of being that creates the finest sliver between self and other, or here, there, that resolves, right? And then there's an experience of no self. And when people go through transitions like that, often there's a sense of temporarily being free from any emotional content. Sometimes there's immersions into a sense of pure nothingness, right? As if it feels like it feels impossible for anything to have manifested in the universe at all. And then, and there's different levels of integration that happen after that, where it's like, oh no, now what's not showing up is nothingness, but the sense of everythingness, right? A sense of totality, and then a sense of, integration of all these different faculties again. And then maybe, emotion comes back, but it comes back differently. It's not emotion that's so much centered on a personalized sense of consciousness, but an emotion that's just sort of body sensations that arise in this kind of undifferentiated space, where we still know where to put the food in our mouth, but everything just feels much more unified. Everything is much more, everything just feels kind of like a oneness that's here, right? And everything just feels like it's showing up in this unified oneness. So I hope that gives at least, a snapshot of what the awakening process tends to be, how that, a more or less common definition as to how that process is defined across, most of the contemplative traditions, if not all of them. So these major ontological shifts have to do with the separate, fragmented sense of self. We go from a fragmented sense of self to a unified sense of self, eventually to various degrees of resolution of the sense of self that's felt as separate from others, and that's felt as separate from a deeper underlying reality. Okay. And what are the ontological shifts that we go through in transformational therapy? We could say that unconscious expectations, attitudes, and mental models, remember, mental model or core beliefs, that the experience of that is feeling as if I am unworthy, right? That's what points to a core belief. That's the experience of a core belief, is the feeling as if I am unworthy. So these are related to trauma or other unconscious emotional learnings. And that's the subject. That's the focus point of transformational therapy. Those get permanently resolved. So an example of the resolution of a mental model. The mental model, once we allow it to speak, we allow it to be heard, we allow it to be fully integrated and held in our adult, compassionate awareness. If I try to succeed in life, I'll just get knocked down, right? It feels as if life is just set up that way. If I try to succeed, I'm going to get knocked down. Maybe what unpacks out of that is when I was younger, this parent or that parent or both was jealous of my success. And that was how they related to me, right? And so they would always try to sabotage they would try to sabotage me when I tried to get good at something. And it really did feel as if reality was that way, because that's how my parents did that relationship with me. They treated me as if I was something about that was hurting them. Now, I'm just going to extend this a little bit. I should have written a little more here in the PowerPoint. That was how that related to me, but not how life actually is, right? That's sort of one type of expectation that might be within this cluster of mental models or core beliefs. Another thing that's often there is that a child wants to avoid hurting their parents, right? That's something that lives in this sort of that often lives in this childlike innocence, and this that's there for many children. They don't want to hurt their parents, right? That's there for most children, I would say. They don't want to hurt their parents, and they. For example, it's something like, oh, when I get good at something, dad responds as if I am hurting him, right? And so that is the core belief to really focus on there. And, if it were my client, I would ask them something like, what do you feel moved to say as your young self is making sense of that? Like, you're hurting dad. And what might come out is, oh my God, no, I'm not hurting dad. It's his, it's his very distorted reality filter that's hurting him. It's his core beliefs actually in his internal setup that for whatever reason are making him respond as if I'm hurting him. I'm not hurting him by, like, I don't know, learning the flute, and being really good at that, whatever it was. I'm not hurting dad by doing that. That's ridiculous, right? And so it's like, now at first it might come out like, oh my God, I'm hurting dad. It might be, there might be, there might be emotional pain and and or anger that comes out, other emotions that might come out. But I would say the core of it really is the sense of, oh my God, I'm that, yeah, he acted as if I was hurting him, but it's like he was seeing through this thick haze of confusion. He wasn't even seeing me, right? He wasn't even seeing me. He wasn't seeing clearly. I wasn't the one who was hurting dad. His sort of broken reality filter. Dad was operating with a malfunctioning reality filter, and that's what was hurting him. It wasn't my learning the flute or whatever it was, right? So that's an example of a resolution of a mental model where a fundamental way of seeing the world, for example, my being good at something hurts somebody else, right? That comes into conscious awareness. It's verbalized, and then there's a juxtaposition experience where that's held in conscious awareness right alongside some truer, deeper way of knowing and seeing things. And then once it encounters that truer, deeper way of seeing things, it's held in compassionate awareness, it dissolves, right? It's just seen as being untrue. And because of that, all of the emotions that are downstream from something like my success hurts other people are also resolved. Because imagine walking around with that belief, my success hurts other people. Well, then every time you try to thrive, every time you start to get good at something, it's as if we're going to have poison breath that's going to just, affect other people in this terrible way. Every time we get good at something, we're the ones doing harm to them. We're the ones that are causing it. Our own flourishing is going to cause pain in some terrible way to somebody else. It's going to, and so the emotion that is generated downstream from that kind of mental model or core belief might be something like, just a pervasive sense of anxiety. And if we really internalize that core belief in if that core belief really lives at this nonverbal feeling level of awareness, we've never really, gotten to a place where it's been uncovered or integrated before, then we're just acting as if that's true, and we're experiencing the anxiety that results from that, right? The anxiety is the aspect of that core belief that we're experiencing all the time. And I think that something that's generalized anxiety, quote unquote, could just be the effect of a number of those core beliefs that are operating unconsciously and that are generating those top level emotions, if that makes sense. Okay. So anyway, the major ontological shifts that happen here in therapy and therapy-informed coaching or other transformative modalities that create these kind of shifts in psychological healing. The major ontological shifts have to do with going from a bad self or a bad reality to a good self or a good reality, right? And it's like the good self or the good reality is based in a deeper sense of truth, right? I would put it that deeper sense of truth actually is the truth that is part of our authentic self. It's part of the truth of clear perception that ultimately has its base in non-dual non-dual or spirituality or awakening. It ultimately has its base there. But a person doesn't need to go into the non-dual level of things necessarily to get to these ontological shifts, right? If you look at coherence therapy or IFS or other, somatic experiencing, we could name a number of other transformative, accelerated experiential dynamic therapy, or, other transformative schools of psychotherapy. They don't necessarily get into non-duality land. They don't have to necessarily to transform these concepts. You can use those experiences to transform these underlying constructs of low self-worth or whatever it is. But you don't have to. Okay. So anyway, these shifts, the ontological shifts that are within therapy, they do happen at a deeper level of the mind than the ordinary thinking mind. And that's really important because they require the integration of that deeper level of the mind with our top level of awareness, with the ordinary, our ordinary level of consciousness, our ordinary thinking mind. They require integration with that in order to be fully resolved. Okay. And this is because we can only resolve problems that we're aware of having. It's hard to, I guess I'd be hard pressed to prove that with absolute certainty, but it's such a reliable principle that I think we can just say that it's generally universally true that since we can only resolve problems that we're aware of having, generally speaking, how would I put this? If the mental model stays in unconscious awareness and it's not integrated, and we don't at least have how would I put this? Let's just say that's generally universally true. We'll circle back to this at some point because it is, once a person goes through some form of spiritual awakening, immersion into fundamental well-being, a non-dual level of consciousness that becomes stable, these transformational shifts that are common to therapy are a lot easier, okay? And this is because we're operating from a deeper level of clarity. You could say our truth sensor becomes a lot sharper. And because of that, we can recognize these untruths at the feeling level that more easily emerge. Does that make sense? It's almost like if your natural room temperature, your inner room temperature, becomes, if your spiritual and emotional room temperature becomes like warmer, a few degrees warmer, your truth sensor, I'm sorry, let me just stick with one analogy at a time. your spiritual and emotional room temperature gets warmer, you're going to notice cold spots a lot easier because there's more contrast, right? And so there is the truth dimension that happens in many forms of non-dual awakening. Once that becomes sharper and more refined, then it becomes easier to recognize those untruths of painful core beliefs. Okay, I hope that makes sense to everybody. Okay, so what are the common shifts or the common ground between ontological shifts that are there within awakening and therapy? We could say a resolution of fetters or samskaras, as you know, in the traditions from the East. Buddhism, I believe the word fetters comes from Buddhism. Samskaras, I think, is shared by Buddhism and Hinduism. You can correct me on that in the comments if I'm wrong about that. But anyway, samskara is sort of like that latent mental tendency that's a self-limiting pattern. Unhealthy attachments, fixed points of view, core beliefs, right? And some forms of awakening can greatly help in resolving low self-worth and anxious attachment, especially when we feel varieties of awakening experiences that really get us into self-other unity, or when it's really tinged with unconditional love. That gets us into a space where we can more readily resolve low self-worth and anxious attachment. Because if this deeper part of our being is actually made of love, if we can experience ourselves that way, it's hard to not love ourselves, right? It's hard to, it's hard to have, and this is something that Judith Blackstone, one of my mentors, is fond of saying, that if we feel like we're made of love, and it's hard to not love ourselves, right? If we can actually feel that that's the substance of what we are. Anxious attachment, one of the ways that these kinds of certain non-dual experiences can resolve anxious attachment is if we really feel a deep sense of unity between ourselves and reality, and ourselves and others. It's almost like, even if you don't, this is my way of describing it, and I tend to use more Western metaphors to describe these kinds of experiences. But let's say that it's like, you can almost, even if you're not connected to other people on a personality level, on an energy level, you could even say on a soul level, you feel a kind of resonance and a togetherness and a withness, and that you're not alone, right? And that's like a baseline feeling that you're not alone. And regardless of what your spiritual paradigm is, that's an experience. This is an experience, even if you're doing, agnostic, Sam Harris style meditation, or if you're ontologically agnostic, like somebody like Daniel Ingram, these are still experiences that are just available to human consciousness. And you can, once you start to experience that kind of oneness, and as you really feel it in your heart and your gut, as Adyashanti talks about, it can really resolve that sense of anxious attachment, if that's something that you have suffered with. Okay, so that's common ground between awakening and therapy. We can also say the last thing here, and there's probably others, but I think these are some of the main ones. Finding a deep level of safety and resourcing, right? There are somatic therapies that get us into our felt sense. They get us into a deeper bodily sense. It's actually a deeper level of consciousness in the thinking mind. It's actually a nice way to get into non-dual experiences from the felt sense versus just doing it from our top level awareness. And the deep level of safety and resourcing that is there in some of the somatic therapies is also there in some of the non-dual methodologies too. Like realization process, for example, combines both of them. So, and we could say that, you find a deeper level of resourcing that feels like it's beneath the trauma, or it's beneath the level of the specific pain that we're trying to get through. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the phases of transformation that happen when deconditioning is effective, when we're doing effective deconditioning. And I'm basing these phases on, things that I've absorbed in my training in coherence therapy. And it's not, this is not a representation of, let's say, coherence therapy. I'm not trying to teach coherence therapy here. This is sort of just my own summary of these phases of deconditioning that you can apply in your own process, and or that, if you need somebody to help you get through something difficult, that you can, for basically uh, any transformation method that's actually effective, it will go through something like this. It'll go through a process like this because your mind has to go through a process like this in order for permanent change to happen. Okay. The subject of the conversation really isn't the specific methodology, although, a methodology, the methodology has to pull the right levers and push the right buttons and have the special sauce that gets your mind to actually go through a shift, that ushers your being through a shift. Okay. So here we go. Usually with a suffering pattern, we start out with a divided mind. And what that means is that the problem that we have seems like it's happening to us or from the outside. So as if low self-worth, codependency patterning, it's like it's some magnetic field that just holds us in limitation and in emotional suffering. It feels like it's happening somewhat outside, well, somewhat or to a good extent outside of our control, right? Phase two would be what I'm calling integration of the symptom. And what this means is that we understand what the active part of our mind is doing to produce the symptom. So we start to move into a place where we can begin to perceive how some deeper part of the mind is actually producing the suffering. It's not coming from outside of us, right? One way of doing that, of integrating the symptom, would be something like, if you were to if you were to sit down at your computer, if you were to sit down and type out, start working on your writing project or your creative art project or whatever it is, you're starting to do an activity during which you normally procrastinate, and just can't seem to get over your procrastination, right? Let's say procrastination is the active response that you're doing. It's the active part of the suffering symptom. So what you could do is say something like, well, if you were to sit down, the only difference being that you didn't procrastinate when you were writing your paper, how would that feel to you? Or if you were to look at your parent, and the only difference is that you don't go into that internal movement where you go into low self-worth and thinking, poorly about yourself, how would that feel? If you don't go into, if when your spouse says something that that irritates you, what if you didn't go into having a response where you yelled at them, right? So that would be an example of starting to integrate the symptom. And I guess you could say to feel into the active part of the mind that's generating the symptom. What that starts to do is unpack and integrate the actual schema or the mental model or core belief that is underneath the production of the symptom. So for example, well, if I don't procrastinate, I notice some anxiety coming up. So the procrastination, we can already start to tell, is sort of a way of mitigating that anxiety. Okay, good. What's that anxiety about? Well, I just remember that this is an example that we'll explore later, but it's something like, well, if I didn't, I remember I'm having memories of dad, and he's telling me that if I don't get my school assignment perfect, then I'm going to be in big trouble. And so the underlying mental model or schema might be something like, well, I need to get it perfect, or else I'm going to get intensely punished. right? I need to get it perfect, or otherwise I'm going to get intensely punished. Um, Not getting it perfect means worthlessness, right? Something like that. So it's like you're allowing that to integrate and unpack. And that's the level or the view of self, other, and reality that at this gut level knowing makes the symptom necessary, right? So if the symptom is procrastinating, what makes that procrastination feel necessary is something like this. At the bottom floor, it's bad performance that is less than perfect means worthlessness. Might be more than one thing, but let's say that that's it. Performance that is less than perfect means I am worthless. I need to get it perfect. That's the next rung upward. That's kind of like the broader kind of response. I need to get it perfect. But there's just so much pressure on me to get it perfect. I can't even look at this assignment. I'm so anxious. I need to just play video games or look at cat videos or whatever it is. Right. So does everybody understand the organization there? And if this doesn't make sense, you can just feel free to write a comment, and I'll try to if there's Q&A on this, you can put it in the comments, and I'll do another video. But so broadly, right, integration of the symptom, integration of the schema, and then transformation of the schema, right, or the underlying mental model or core belief. So explore what it would be like without this view of reality. That's just the basic step of it. Now, that's not to say that we're trying to do an override or to put pressure on ourselves to install a new belief. That's not what this is. What we're doing is that we're trusting that a deeper part of us knows, for the fact that we are suffering with a core belief means that there is part of us that knows that has put us off balance somehow, that core belief has put us off balance. It's, the fact that our system is crying out for help and is in pain means that part of us wants this belief to be resolved, wants the suffering to be resolved, because there is some deeper and truer way of seeing the world that is there beneath the surface, that some part of us kind of knows is there, but it's not really allowed to emerge yet, right? And in my view, that kind of implies, even if a lot of these transformative modes of therapy don't directly acknowledge it, to me, that implies this deeper underlying spiritual reality out of which that sense of deep truth emerges, right? Truth, love, freedom from suffering, that there is a deeper spiritual space out of which that all emerges. Okay. Now, so transformation of the schema, phase 4, explore what it would be like without this view of reality. So this will either provoke a shift, or there's going to be other related schemas that are still deeper. So exploring what it'd be like without this view of reality, it'd be something like, it's as if perfection equals, if I don't get it right, that means worthlessness. Anything short of perception means that I can't get it right. I'll never get it right. I'm worthless as a being. And the exploration that could be like, yes, Dad treated you as if that were true. One question might be, does that feel true to every part of you, that your most essential worth is, it hinges on how you perform? Does that feel true to every part of you, right? That could be one useful experiential question that would start to disentangle those threads, that association between worth and performance, fundamental worth and performance. Another thing, a way in which some of the non-dual kinds of therapy or therapy adjacent modalities, like the realization process, which have a lot of therapeutic elements in them. Realization process, the way that I've incorporated realization process into shifting or transforming deeper level schemas is something like, tuning into your quality of self what your quality of self actually feels like viscerally. Can you feel anything that is at your most basic sense of self that feels like worthlessness, that matches the sense of worthlessness that you feel, that you feel, accused of by this inner schema or by dad's voice? Does that view of worthlessness actually match the way that your inner being actually feels? And 100% of the time, pretty much, with some, well, maybe not 100% of the time, most of the time, right? Let me put it this way: 100% of the time, if the person can actually access that level of their being, the answer is no, it doesn't match. No, actually, oh wow, I expected when I looked into my own being, I would just feel nothing at all because I've heard teachings about no self. But wait a minute, I actually do feel like there's a presence there and it feels fundamentally good, right? That's usually the response. Okay. So, and sometimes when a person says, no, I can't feel that, it's just because the schema of worthlessness is just too active and we need to do other work. And, it just means that they can't quite access their fundamental goodness just yet. In any case, so that, I hope that paints the picture of transformation. And then the verification phase that the schema is resolved is something like this. If you experience a kind of gut level shift where, this belief that was really unconscious, living at the feeling level of being, comes into verbal awareness, and then it's like, when we look at that relative to a deeper sense of truth, it dissolves and we really feel a shift. Sometimes it can even feel disorienting at our, at a fundamental level of being, like at the tectonic plates of the mind that really live through the whole body. We feel a shift. And the next few days, we notice, oh, wow, my experience overall feels lighter. And we notice that when we get into different situations that would normally trigger us, things that would normally spike a low self-worth pattern or a shame pattern or something like that, not good enough pattern. It's like, wait a minute. A few days ago, that situation really bothered me. I'm not really feeling much of anything right now. It just feels like neutral, like doesn't bother me at all. That would be verification. That would be, verification. Like, if that lasts for, let's say, like a few months, that's a good, a good signal, a good sign that the schema was actually resolved, right? So this is, I hope we can see that this is an empirical process that is based on how the mind actually works. It's based, the current theory, at least in the neuroscience of all this, is that this is transformative therapeutic work is based in, among other things, but one thing that it's based in is the reorganization, or say reconsolidation, of memory, specifically semantic memory, which is the memory of, and we're not talking about somatic memory, although it is part of our somatic memory, but semantic memory, which means kind of, semantic memory is like the memory or learnings about broader facts or abstractions about life. For example, I am the type of, it's not just an event like mom was mean to me. It's a type of learning about what that means, which is something like, mom treated me as if I'm worthless, therefore I must be worthless. I am the type of being that must be worthless, or this pattern of facts means something about myself, others, or reality. And you could say that learning is a type of memory, right? People that, this is just a very brief aside. One of my clients had told me about her mother who had Alzheimer's. And she said that, she forgot so much about her life that it's like she forgot her cruelty. Her mom became not a lot nicer after she got, after she had Alzheimer's for a while. And I believe that part of that is because of you could say, forgetting of various various types. And one of that type, I think, anyway, I don't want to go on a tangent here, but but there might have been some, forgetting of some of the things, some of the imprints that made mom as mean as she was. Okay. So anyway, so yeah, so this process is rooted in something called memory reconsolidation. You can do research on it if you want. The Coherence Therapy folks have done a lot of great work on this. You can go to coherencetherapy.org and download articles about how memory reconsolidation relates to psychotherapy and semantic memory and all of that if you're a neuroscience person. Anyway, we don't need to know about memory reconsolidation in order to understand this process. Okay, so here's the deeper dive, right? Is there a cheat code to the deconditioning process or to this process of transformation? Transformation meaning that you go through a permanent shift of one of those mental models or schemas. And here's the proposal. All deconditioning modalities that result in permanent change must uncover the symptom of suffering and resolve the schema that makes the suffering necessary. It's as simple as that. This process has to be experiential and not top level or conceptual only, right? We can have deeper level knowings integrate into top level conceptual awareness, but the whole process can't just live in conceptual awareness, because what we're trying to do is excavate, or I guess you could say, to use another metaphor, we're trying to bring up content out of the basement and sort it out. So if you don't open the door to the basement and go down to the basement, you're not going to reorganize things that are in the basement. If you just stay in the living room or the kitchen, you're really not going to do much. You're just going to muck around with things that are in the kitchen or in the living room. And you're not going to get at any of the deeper level stuff. So any given method, we can think about a metaphor like tracing a thread of suffering back to its origin. And we don't need to do too much exploration of the past. You can do as much exploration of the past as is necessary, but what's really important to focus on is the schema that is happening in the present that is mistaken for how reality actually is. Okay, I'll say that again. The schema is the cause of the symptom of suffering, not the past events. The past events, they happened, they were painful. There's a lot of past events that that happen to us or that we go through that are painful. Not all of them create these deeper levels of meaning that affect us still in the present and that seem to be resistant to the flow of time, right? So it's the schema that happens in the present that's the cause of these top level symptoms. That is what the focus of deconditioning work, transformational therapy, transformative coaching, therapy-informed coaching, right? That's what the target has to be, or the focus has to be, okay? All right. How do we trace a thread of suffering to from its surface symptoms or surface responses or symptoms, and then into the underlying roots that generate responses? So we could talk about 4 levels here. We got the surface symptom, emotions, behaviors, energetics, tensions in the body that have emotional meaning. That's what I mean by energetics in this case. And we've got the next level down would be prior experiences and memories that form associations that are linked to specific sufferings. And those are linked to present events that are not as high stakes or threatening. For example, when somebody's working on their paper and they associate it to messages that they got from dad, or they associated it to treatment that they got from dad. And you could say and so that's sort of the anxiety and the emotional memory there. Deeper than that are the internalized messages and meanings from those experiences. Okay, well, dad is telling me that I need to get this right. I need to get this right. I need to get perfect marks. Otherwise, I'm no good. There's this urgently felt need to respond in a certain way that makes sense according to this underlying view of reality. And the underlying view of reality is the next layer down, according to which we're intensely vulnerable to a specific form of suffering, and which is actually the core level of suffering. The view of how reality is that makes us specifically vulnerable to the suffering that's at the top level, or at the surface level. So, for example, I need to get good grades, otherwise I'm worthless. I need to get perfect marks on my school assignment. Otherwise, I'm just no good and worthless. It's going to confirm how worthless I am, and that's just going to it's going to plunge me into the sense of shame and just feeling terrible. Excuse me, about myself. I'm just going to feel so isolated if I don't get, it's just going to plunge me into all of that. Another mental model that can be attached to the same experiences, and this is why we can't just focus on experiences, we have to focus on the meaning of them. Another mental model that can be attached to the same set of terrible experiences could be something like this. Dad is responding as if if I get less than an A+, that he's really hurt by that in some way, right? And we'll explore this later, but I just want to see that, I just want everybody to see that that's the underlying view of reality that's attached to these internalized messages, right? And so that's the level that this is like the underlying level that we need to get to in order to have a full transformation or full resolution that then that then echoes through our experience and creates a permanent shift. All right, so I'm going to go through a method here, and the purpose here isn't to like teach you in a way where you could watch this video and then you could just like do it. You'd like know what to do. I just want to do a little bit of a deeper dive so that you can identify if a therapy method is doing these steps, okay, or some version of them. If the person that you're working with, therapy-informed coach, transformative coach, therapist, whatever, if you're with a practitioner who's working like that and your focus is on trauma or limiting beliefs, then they're doing something like this, okay? Doesn't have to be exactly this, but they're doing a process that has these elements in it, okay? All right, and now I'm calling this, because I've taught this in other contexts for people who are more experienced. I've taught this as something that they can, as a method that they can try to follow. I'm just calling it coherence-focused inquiry, because it's an inquiry that's focused on how any symptom of suffering, unless it's like biologically caused, like a thyroid issue or something like that, but any suffering that is based in meaning, a deeper level of meaning that we have, it makes sense, right? It's coherent. It makes sense evolutionarily because, for example, if we were berated by dad, if we didn't do X, Y, or Z, well, that means we have to do X, Y, or Z in order to survive. And actually that mental model of, oh, I'm not good enough unless I do X, Y, or Z this way, that is actually, that you could say served an evolutionary purpose, or it served a survival purpose at that time, right? It was something that we could argue that it served a purpose. It was a skillful means by which we survived as children during a moment in our life where that was the only way that we could have gotten by. We needed to make meaning of the world that way, or we made meaning of the world that way, and so our responses to that meaning made sense, right? And so that's all that coherence means. It just means it makes sense, right? So coherence-focused inquiry. And okay, so let's just go through it. So first, we could say we're finding the active aspect of our suffering. What that means is that we assume, or the person that we're working with assumes, that there is some part of the mind or self that is actively generating the suffering, unless the cause is biological. And so this is what we have to identify first. So I'll just use that same example I've been using. When I sit down on my computer to do a writing project, I begin feeling nervous and then I procrastinate. That's the active thing that we're doing. We procrastinate, and that's active. Feeling nervous is something that happens passively, and procrastination happens actively. Okay, so that's a super important distinction. Then we could say, as a step 2, we can imagine ourselves without the active part of the suffering. So, and again, any method that's transformative in nature has to do something like this, or it has to directly or indirectly bring the mind through an experience like this. What would happen if you didn't go into procrastination? You don't go into the suffering symptom that's actively being done by the mind. What happens if you don't go into procrastination? when you're sitting down at your computer ready to work, what happens if you don't procrastinate? Another way of saying the same thing is if you imagine yourself moving forward with your writing project without procrastinating, what happens? And then the key here is just to let whatever comes up come up, and to allow yourself to know what feels uncomfortable without judgment. Okay. But by the way, as we're going through this, my intent is not to evoke traumatic experiences that you might have had or anything like that. What I would do is just listen to this without thinking about your own example, especially if you've been through really difficult things in your life. And then if you do feel moved to do work on your own situation, you can pick a practitioner that feels good for you. If you really do feel safe enough and you want to try some of these techniques, you can, but I would really suggest doing that with the guidance of somebody who is professionally trained. Okay. I just want to put that out there. So again, my intent is not to dredge up traumatic symptoms in you. That's not the intent of this presentation. It's just to educate. And, I'm using an example that that is a fictional example, but that's, I could say, based on like a number of different client examples that I've had over the years. Okay, so that's it. It's not based on anybody specific. It's just one example, and it's not, the intent here is not for you to dredge up any of your own material if that's going to destabilize you. Okay, so I just want to make that clear, because we're going to go into the deeper levels of this and what they're made of. Okay. So as a step 3, whatever method we're going through has to avoid overrides and temptations to bypass, unless our safety is really at risk, right? Unless the situation is something like, well, I just feel so hopeless, I feel suicidal, or I feel like I'm going to hurt somebody, right? Then, that's when overrides are appropriate, or we have to say, okay, well, I have to rein myself in here and come up with a safety plan. That's really where we need to work with, a psychologist or a social worker, some professional, not a life coach in that situation, or a therapy-informed coach, not somebody who's out of state, somebody who's close by, and to work under the supervision of, generally an outpatient team, if it's something like that. Okay, so I just want to make that clear. If we're working with somebody that's more alternative, work with that person as, an adjunct and not the primary source of care. Okay, so anyway, but if our situation is not that, and it feels workable to us, then we want to make sure, and it's not, it's nothing life-threatening, that we want to avoid overrides and temptations to bypass, and allow ourselves to know the emotional truth of a situation. So for example, a common spiritual override or attempt to bypass would be something like this. Oh, yeah, I can notice that tendency to procrastinate. That must come from a victim mentality. And I'm going to just disidentify from this victim mentality. I know that old victim mentality. I'm just going to disidentify from that. And I'm just going to tell myself, oh, that's not me, or that's not rational, or this isn't my true self, or oh, that's not pure awareness. Okay. That's called spiritual bypassing. That is called override. And it's override, I believe, is a word from somatic experiencing. It's a good word, right? Because we're trying to override, not deliberately, but we're overriding the emotional truth as it's emerging. So that's an example of overriding. An example of actually just being compassionately present to our emotional truth, where the intent, it's a sincere, open-hearted, open-minded attempt to know, just to know, and to be open to the feeling level of our being. Okay. It's something like this. I notice a sense of anxiety coming up in my midsection. And this anxiety, okay, this is part of me. This is part of who I am, and that's okay. So without judging or applying preconceived moral or spiritual standards to it, we just let the emotion come up. Okay. All right. Then we allow the emotional truth to fully integrate and become clear. So we stay with the emotional sensations until clarity and integration of what's there and what they're made of naturally emerges. So, for example, what does this anxiety feel like it's about? And then we stay open to images and memories and connotations or themes that emerge. An alternative inquiry might be, I'm responding anxiously as if blank is going to happen. And then just you kind of just rest back into it and see what's there. And so this allows for the unpacking of specific themes to come into memory. And once again, I'll just say here that if you suspect that you've been through some sort of trauma or your body is responding in some really heightened anxious way as if you've been through a trauma and you want to try this work, I would try it with a practitioner. The intent here again is just to educate about, the type of process that a practitioner can bring you through that has to happen when it's effective. Okay. All right. So this allows for the unpacking of specific themes into memory when we do this step. So for example, I'm remembering how a dad used to berate me if I got anything less than an A+ on an assignment. Okay. So then we get clarity on how the meaning from these earlier experiences still affect us today. The stimulus of beratement from dad is over, but the meaning still lives on in terms of how we urgently need to respond to situations that remind us of that in some way, that are similar. And so it's sort of it becomes a generalized pattern versus just, oh, this is how I need to respond to dad now in order to not get punished or whatever. It becomes a generalized pattern to other situations in life. So this is the domain where the domain of our emotional responses opens to the underlying schema or ontology, the ontological level of being. And the schema itself often feels very emotionally charged, might even trigger an altered state of consciousness when we integrate it. That's normal too. We might feel like we go into a light trance or that we're feeling the same tone of the childlike ego state that we were in when the initial painful experience happened. Okay, and that's normal. Here's the thing. Here's one thing to remember. And I know I've given several precautions about staying safe and being resourced and working with a skilled practitioner when you go through something like this process. I know I've made all those disclaimers. At the same time, if we've been through something that is really difficult and we're left with the echoes of it in our system, that's what we're left with. We're left with the echoes, right? We were already through that horrendous event, whatever it was, or abusive relationship, mistreatment, neglect, whatever it happened to have been. And the thing is that even if we experience the echoes of it on the way out, our mind-body system has already been through it. So the worst that's going to happen is when it's on its way out. Well, the worst that could happen is if we don't work with a skilled practitioner, we'll get re-traumatized. We might just be flooded with those, memories and sensations again without the skillful means by which to navigate them. That's the worst that can happen. But, the event itself, by remembering it, will not happen again. That's one thing. The other thing is that when we do work with a skillful practitioner, the worst that's really going to happen is that we experience some of the distress when it's on its way out. Okay. And that's normal. Doesn't mean that we have to relive the event. That's not the point. We might experience, the charge, the emotional energy of that event again when it's on its way out. And that's that, right? And then we can reprocess it once we've once we've dissolved the underlying mental model that continues to generate the suffering in our system. Okay. All right. So anyway, this is the domain when we get clarity on the meaning of these earlier experiences and how they affect us today. This is where the domain of emotional responses opens up to the underlying schema, which is that ontological level. Now, a schema is not an emotion, but it feels like it is saturated with emotion. It has an emotional charge to it that's very powerful often. And it might trigger, grief or sadness or anger, all sorts of different emotions that we, in the West, we often view as problematic, which are just normal, right? But they might start to resurface. And that's good, right? We want to know what those feelings are and just, you let them move through us organically. The schema, we could say, lives at a deeper level than the emotional level per se. And this is because here's my argument for this. We can resolve an emotion and the emotion is clear, but we don't resolve the underlying schema. So for example, let's say we're really, we're really in a state of, deep sadness, hopelessness, And then, we go to the gym, we have an amazing workout. Feel so cleared out, right? And grounded again. Okay, so we clear the emotion in that situation. Or we feel really frustrated, really, we feel anxious about something or depressed. We have an amazing meditation session, and so settled, so resourced, can feel the ground of our being. Okay, the emotion's clear. Okay, now that can happen, and it doesn't resolve the underlying schema. Okay, we can resolve an emotion without resolving the underlying schema, but when we resolve the underlying schema, it always resolves the top level emotions that are linked to it, right? If anxiety, so a more generalized top level of anxiety, or a more pervasive top level of anxiety, let's say that's made of like several types of anxiety that all kind of blend together, but all of those different little nodes of anxiety are linked to specific schemas. So let's say you've got like 6 little pools of anxiety that all kind of coalesce together, right? And then one of those pools is linked to a schema, is linked to like 3 different schemas. Then we clear those schemas, and then one of those pools of anxiety is gone, right? And so our baseline sense of anxiety is a lot less, right? And the more we start to resolve those schemas that are linked to all those different types of anxiety, the anxiety dissipates, so that eventually we just have we no longer have a top level generalized sense of anxiety. Okay, so that's what that means. We can resolve an emotion without resolving a schema, but we cannot resolve a schema without also resolving the top level of emotions, because that's what's generating them, right? It's like you can turn off the car radio without turning off the engine, but if you turn off the engine, then it's always going to turn off the radio, if that makes sense, right? If you turn the car off, the radio goes off. Okay. All right, so here are some examples about getting clarity on present moment meaning. What messages do I feel I internalized from being berated by dad? What did I internalize about those experiences that are still with me today? Alternatively, what felt like the worst thing about being berated by dad? And it can be helpful to explore this with another person who can hold space, especially for very painful memories. Again, this is just to educate. That I'm not advising that anybody do these steps as you're watching this video. Possible answers. Well, that meant that I was no good. Not just that I made a mistake, but that my sense of worth as a being was always on shaky ground. I really needed to get straight A's or else. It was a very narrow window by which, narrow path or window within which I could get praise or connection and avoid punishment. Okay. Deeper meaning. Okay. Deeper. So that's clarity on how the deeper meaning, or what deeper meaning was there in those earlier experiences, and what still feels present today at that, deeper felt sense level. Okay. Next, get clarity on what schema or view of reality we felt pressured to respond to that is still present. Now, this is not analytic. It's not conceptual. It's not something that we need to think about even. It emerges spontaneously at the feeling level of being. So for example, my worth hinges on getting good grades. That was the meaning that I got from this earlier experience. And then the broader view of reality that still feels with me is, oh my God, my worth as a being hinges on how the world views my skills in writing this paper. My worth as a being depends on my performance. And wow, such a high anxiety setup. As my worth as a being depends on my performance. My connection with dad hinges on getting good grades. It feels as if the only way I'll get connection is showing how competent I am. Okay. That could be another schema that's right there. I'll get intensely punished if I make a mistake. Threats of physical punishment often relate to, so this is just one thing I want to say about punishment. A lot of times, punishment or fear of punishment has a strong relational component to it that's sort of generating the fear of punishment as a side effect. This has been my experience as a doing this kind of work as a therapy-informed coach. So here's what that means. I feel like if I make a mistake, I will get intensely berated. And it's like I deserve it, right? But it's not like we're actually afraid. It's like if you were to ask the person something like, does that mean that you actually feel like the audience is going to throw stones at you and really physically hurt you if you make a mistake? No, I don't think that's true. It's more like it's kind of like I deserve it, and it's like the sense of deserving punishment, which that's more complicated. I'm not going to go into that in this presentation, but the sense of deserving punishment is what makes the threat of punishment loom large. Okay, well, I'll just leave it at that. I hope that makes sense. So the 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 threat of punishment, even though it's not like rational, or at our adult level, we know that the audience is not going to throw stones at us or whatever, right? The threat of physical punishment still looms large because some part of us feels as if we deserve it. Okay, so I'll just leave it at that for now. So that's why that makes sense, even if, uh, at our top level of awareness, we know that that's not true. Now, often, once we've unpacked these different schemas that are there, it's helpful to pick which one stands out the most or feel like it's the most pronounced form of suffering. And that's just because, unless it's really overwhelming and we need to work with another one first. Um, but still, the point is that if we can work with the one that has the most pronounced form of suffering in it, it's good to work with that because that is going to create the most amount of relief once it's resolved. So if it feels safe enough to work with the worst one first. That's at least one of my best practices. Now, an example. My worth as a being depends on my performance. So that feels like the worst thing. This is just such a high anxiety setup, and it's going to feel timeless to the person until it's looked at, or until that a deeper level of truth is experienced that directly disconfirms the truth of, or validity of worthlessness, right? Of worth depending on performance. Until that is experientially disconfirmed by a deeper level of knowing, it's going to stay right where it is. It's gonna stay intact, generating that top level anxiety, if that makes sense. Okay. All right. Inquire into what life would feel like without this view of self, other, or reality. And so this helps us disentangle an unconscious level of volition from the core level of the schema. So what we do is we make sure to stay in touch with the emotional truth of what is happening still. That's the bass drum of this process. We have to compassionately, in a way where our desire is just to know and just to feel within our window of tolerance. We make sure to stay in touch with the emotional truth of what is happening. Yes, Dad did treat me as if my value as a being depended on my grades. And it felt like that was the only way I could make sense of him treating me that way, that my worth as a being did actually hinge upon getting good grades. Then we can proceed to, how does it feel as an adult to look back at my young self making sense of Dad's beratement that way? Is there anything I might feel moved to say to my young self when he or she starts to believe that they're no good because of what Dad was saying? Is there anything I might feel moved to say to my young self? Yeah, you're fine the way that you are. You're good the way that you are. You didn't deserve that treatment from Dad. He was very confused. He couldn't even see you through that thick haze of confusion, right? That would be the kind of thing that spontaneously comes up from a deeper, truer level of being, and that can dissolve that the core level of the pain point, which is my worth as a being hinges on my performance, right? Or hinges on getting good grades. Now, usually from here, there's an emotional release or a catharsis. There's often, grief that comes up, tears of release, and, eventually they get into sort of even joy, or just a deep sense of settledness and peace. Like, oh my God, I've been seeing myself this way. I've been seeing reality this way for so long. And I know why I did that, and why I made meaning of my earlier life situation that way. And, it was just a skillful means of surviving, and that type of thing. and I'm okay just as I am, and that really feels true at a gut level now. And there's really nothing that could take away that sense of fundamental goodness, right? Um, that's well, that's what you could say solidifies the shift. Um, you know, the deeper, truer level of being becomes the more predominant way of knowing, and the view of how we are outside of conscious awareness is dissolved. It enters awareness and it's dissolved. And again, it's like once we turn the engine off, the radio is off. The radio goes off. So what that means is that, like the engine of suffering gets turned off, and the negative messages that we have about ourselves, the whatchamacallit, the anxiety that's linked to that specific schema, that also is resolved because it has no more need to function. And also the response of procrastination is also resolved if that was the only thing driving, right? If that was the only schema driving it, then the procrastination would get resolved, if that makes sense. It's not like we wouldn't, how would I put this? The procrastination is a response. It's a response to anxiety in that situation. If we procrastinated for the fact that there was, I don't know, a cat video that was just the most amazing cat video on the planet, and we just had to look at it or something, and it was like a one-time thing, right? Then that's a different thing, right? That's altogether different. It doesn't refer to a persistent or pervasive pattern anymore. The response to procrastination doesn't come from that place. It just comes from the fact that, for a minute, maybe we want to watch this amazing cat video. But I guess the larger point that I'm making is that procrastination for that cause, the larger pattern of procrastination out of that underlying cause of feeling not good enough and feeling that high anxiety setup, and procrastination as a way to mitigate a kind of baseline level of anxiety that comes with the performance related to doing our paper. Once that's resolved, then the procrastination is resolved, right? Okay, I hope that makes sense. All right. Often a step that we have to do to let everything gel together is inquire what it is like to let all of this to land, and if it feels okay for it to land. Sometimes there's additional schemas to resolve around the same issue to which the same general procedure applies. Sorry, I didn't put that in. To which the same general procedure applies. Okay, so for example, yeah, wow, it feels good for that to land, but there's really nothing wrong with my sense of being. But wait a minute, if dad wasn't right about me, I'm really pissed. I spent how many years trying to get to a core level of self-worth by performing at this perfect standard based on dad's broken reality filter. Wow, what a waste of time. So there's motions of regret and anger that come up, and that's all important to just allow to process. It makes sense to just allow those, feelings to move through. If there's guilt or shame or judgment about maybe not having resolved the schema earlier on, this just impedes it from fully resolving in the present. It can just loop back into the I must not be good enough or smart enough or whatever type of pattern. I hope that makes sense. Another example of an adjacent schema is it feels great. It feels great to have that burden lifted, to know that my self-worth doesn't hinge upon how I perform academically or otherwise. But there's something else here. I'm remembering that dad would also seem hurt when I got bad grades, as if this damaged the family's reputation in some larger sense, and that dad felt hurt by this. And I just noticed my young self urgently not wanting to hurt dad. And one thing that we can recognize here again is like the child's innocence in this situation. The child innocently believes that his or her academic performance is hurting dad. And yeah, oh, wow. And oh, but wait a minute, as an adult, that wasn't hurting dad. Like my academic performance, it's like that wasn't actually hurting him. His the cloud of confusion that he was in, his beliefs about my grades were what were hurting him. His beliefs about, my academic performance, he believed that those were hurting him, but his beliefs were what were hurting him, not my grades, right? Or not me, you know? Um, and, just putting to words in the schema in the present that gets if we were to put it into words, the schema that gets dissolved here in the present would be something like, my ability to make mistakes felt like it was my ability to make mistakes when I was a kid, just, small academic mistakes, were just like this ticking time bomb that might hurt dad. And nowadays it feels like, oh my God, that same fear is there. Like, oh my God, if I make a mistake, I'm going to hurt somebody. It's just going to be devastating. And it's my responsibility and my duty to perform at this flawless level, so I don't create some cataclysmic hurt upon somebody else, right? And wait a minute, that's not how I'm not really going to do that. That's not how reality works. I'm not, my making some sort of academic error or error in my paper is not going to that's not what's going to hurt somebody, right? That's not going to hurt somebody. It's just going to be a mistake, right? So I hope that makes sense to everybody. I've got 2 more slides here, and then actually just really one that we'll unpack, and then we'll wrap up here. I want to talk about levels of functioning within and beyond the mind. So this presentation was titled "Nondual Therapy That Works." Okay, and we can think about these different levels of the mind where different levels of a suffering symptom live, and this kind of level that I'm calling beyond the mind, that pervades all levels of the mind. Okay, all right. So let's say non-duality, non-dual meditation, and different spiritual traditions, they lead us towards this ground of being that pervades all levels of mind. It's also beyond the conscious and subconscious mind. And I'll put to you that even, all right, this gets a little technical, but there are some meditation or some spiritual traditions. There's a big argument over this, apparently, especially in the Eastern traditions, in Buddhism, which is whether there is or is not a ground of being. Okay. Now, recently I had an interview with Daniel Ingram, which should be up pretty soon on my YouTube page. But basically, he used to be a ground of being guy. Now he's not a ground of being guy, right? Or he's ontologically agnostic about the ground of being, but feels that the groundlessness view is clearer. I think I'm paraphrasing things that I've heard him say before. Here's the point, right? We can still feel a sense of stillness and fundamental well-being that suffuses all of our experience. That's part of our experience. And that becomes implicit. It just becomes part of how reality is, regardless of whether we're a ground of being person or not a ground of being person. But what I would submit to you is that even if you're not a ground of being person, you can still tune in to a deep sense of stillness or fundamental well-being that seems to be that seems to be part of reality that lives that lives beneath things that are stressing you out. Okay, and that's a way of explaining it to people who are not meditators, and for people who are experienced meditators. There's several different forms of stillness and flavors of fundamental well-being that you can directly experience and that you can sort of rest into and be absorbed into. I tend to be aligned with the view that there is a ground of being. At a certain point, that becomes indistinguishable from the rest of being. But at first, it does feel like it's a field, it's a space, it's a ground that, in a way, it almost feels like nothingness. And it's not a thing, and it's not a space, even though we use space as a metaphor for it. But we can feel when we tune into it, we can feel the effects of it, right? We can notice its effects. For example, a fundamental sense of well-being, a sense of stillness and spaciousness. What else? luminosity that emerges, love, oneness, you know. And so anyway, I don't want to go too much into that right now, but some really wonderful books to read about how this ground of our being affects our our healing process. One would be Trauma in the Unbound Body by Judith Blackstone, and another would be The Fullness of the Ground by Judith Blackstone, which is her recent book about stabilizing in this fundamental dimension of consciousness. Okay. Others who seem to take this view of a ground of being that you can read about are some of the more well-known near-death experiencers. One person that comes to mind is Natalie Sudman, a near-death experiencer who talked about how, oh man, I'm paraphrasing. I hope I'm getting this right. And Natalie Sudman, if you ever watch this video, just tell me if this is off. But basically, she had talked about how in her near-death experience, it's like she went so deep inside that the stillness that was inside seemed like it was everything. You know, the inside became the outside, that type of thing. And since that underlying, dimension of being really feels fundamental, that's why it's called a space or a ground or, a field that is our fundamental dimension of consciousness. Another well-known near-death experiencer named Mellon Thomas Benedict, when he was in his near-death experience, there was a being that he was conversing with, and and Mellon asks him, "Well, is this heaven?" And the being said, "You and everything else in creation has always been in heaven since the beginning of time." And I thought that was just so wonderful, because it does point us back to this underlying space or field or ground that's always there in the background and that we can access whenever we want to. Or we can access with some attunement. The realization process practices are a wonderful way to do that. And you can watch some of my other videos on those, or go to realizationprocess.org to find a teacher if you want to learn this method. Okay. So I want to say anything else about that? Yeah, I mean, and again, that just reminds me of some of the Zen teachings, which is this, I forget who said this, but it was, I have never moved from the beginning, right? There's a part of our subjectivity that never moves from the beginning. Our subjectivity moves, but this underlying space or field or ground is, you could say, an aspect of our total, of what is, that is steady state. That seems to just be, a kind of stillness or a source of stillness. Yeah, it's hard to say if it in and of itself has qualities, or if things like spaciousness and stillness, if those are qualities, very subtle ones that emerge from whatever this kind of ineffable, mysterious ground is. Anyway, okay, so I think I've talked enough about the ground of being. Now, this underlying level pervades and suffuses all other dimensions of the mind, all other levels of the mind that we're going to talk about here, okay? And I am, phenomenologically, it does feel like it's beyond the normal ranges of the mind. And so that's why I'm calling it beyond the mind. And that's just to talk about how it is experientially. So we could say that we have a thinking mind and a feeling mind. And it's important to talk about those levels in order to talk about how, where it's important to talk about those levels when we talk about digging the well or tracing the thread down into a core level of suffering and integrating it with conscious awareness and then resolving it. Okay, so let's say here we go, levels of the mind. Feeling mind, which is where our subconscious lives. We could say it's an implicit level of awareness, of awareness. Our felt sense, that's where all the subconscious lives, in this sort of felt sense of emotional bodily sensations and other subtle feeling sensations in the body. It's our primal level of being, our child mind, etc. Okay, so that's where all that stuff lives, in our feeling mind. And then in our thinking level of mind, we could say that's conscious, explicit verbal awareness. It's our adult level, our quote unquote rational level. That's where our rational level lives. And we could say it's our adult mind, and so on and so forth. Okay. All right, so let's talk about surface level responses. So this is the example that we used earlier. Anxiety is felt when we're writing. So then the anxiety is what's happening at the feeling level, and at our conscious level, it's like, oh, I'm gonna procrastinate, right? That's what we know, what's most readily available to our thinking level of awareness. And anxiety, we don't have to do much integration to know that we're anxious, right? So these are pretty, these are already pretty much in our both in our feeling awareness and thinking awareness at the same time. Okay. Then if we start to trace the thread or dig the well, we get down into what's beneath the anxiety. Well, beneath the anxiety is memories of dad berating me because unless I got perfect academic performance or I did perfectly on my paper, and the, painful emotions that grief, fear, anger, whatever it is, those start to emerge. And as part of this, remembering this pattern of beratement from dad, the emotions that are tied to that emerge. Okay. Then if we talk about the meanings and, the deeper level of meaning and what we felt, how we felt we had to respond to those, those beratements from dad, what the deeper meanings of that beratement actually were. The urgent felt need starts to emerge out of our feeling level. Again, this is nonverbal. Until it comes into verbal awareness, it's a nonverbal felt meaning that's very specific. In the same way that when we jump back from a car that's coming towards us, that's happening all at our feeling level of being, but our body knows what to do, right? Because the level of meaning of what the car is and what we need to do about it is specific. It's a specific thing. We don't have a meaning that we need to run up and give the car a hug, right? That's not the meaning that comes up when the car is coming towards us. The meaning is get out of the way. So when we focus, we kind of just hover on the memory and the emotion that emerge. I remember this pattern of beratement from dad. The urgent felt underlying need emerges. Oh, oh, wow, I knew that I needed to perform perfectly. Huh. Yeah, I needed to do that. And then the deeper level schema is, just continuing to allow that feeling knowing to integrate as if my sense of worth as a being was at stake if I didn't get those perfect grades, right? So these are, we could say these are 4 different levels of, you could call them levels of the mind or levels of, the suffering symptom. And we could say that something here that also pervades all of these different levels, you could say, is a kind of volition. You could say that, we start off again having a divided mind. You could also call it a divided will, a divided sense of volition. Where part of us wants to thrive, part of us wants to, whatever it is, be creative, do get our writing project done, flourish in our profession or in our family, in a hobby, pursue spiritual enlightenment, whatever it is. And then there's another aspect of our volition that's unconscious that says, yeah, okay, yeah, we want to do this on this level, but if I move forward this way, it's going to bump into this, that, and the other kind of mental model. So we could say that the underlying mental models are kind of fused with this volition. Reality is such that A, B, or C, and I need to do X, Y, and Z. That I need to do, right? It's fused with volition. So when we feel a shift, our most basic sense of energy and power and our local sense of self, sorry, I'm missing a word there. That should say local sense of self. They're all entangled with the schema and they're felt as a constriction or self-limitation. It's a constriction in our senses, a constriction in our faculties of perception, a constriction of our emotion, a constriction of our ability to perceive, right? Constriction in our energy. So once the schema at this primal unconscious level integrates with full conscious awareness and is resolved, then our fundamental sense of energy and this fundamental sense of volition, our most basic, sense of desire, shifts. Our fundamental energy is liberated from the schema the constriction and self-limitation that relates to this specific schema is resolved, we experience a radical shift and more deeply embody whether it's our awakening or our authentic self or both. I see both of those as intertwined. We experience a shift, a radical shift where that sense of authenticity comes more deeply to the fore. We're more deeply able to embody our sense of spiritual awakening. Okay, so I hope this paints, a picture, a detailed picture that at least makes theoretical sense to you, and that sounds like something that you could empirically verify within your own experience, and that this model maybe sheds some light on how non-duality and therapy are related to each other, because we're talking about, again, when we make these deep level ontological shifts, it has a direct impact on our spiritual awakening. Because look, I'll just give you one example. I have a friend of mine who is very experienced in contemplative practices, very deep in her level of fundamental well-being and her experience of and she's done a lot of Buddhist practices. She would call it anatta, the experience of, like, she lives at a deeper level of being, let's say, than a kind of conceptual fragmented sense of self. And that's where she reports that she lives. But once she had resolved a pattern that was still remaining around associating with narcissists, right? And sort of like, I guess, what would you call it? Being accommodating to people with narcissistic patterning. She had uncovered some of her own mental models around being too accommodating, and she was able to draw, clearer boundaries as a kind of, a top level response to that resolved mental model. She said it was like, there was just more aliveness in her being, like colors came into view with greater clarity and sharpness. And just, there was a deeper level of aliveness that she was able to come in touch with, right? And so we could say that, both enlightenment and what I like to call enlivenment, I believe that those are really two sides of the same coin. We can experience all of those nice subtle levels of being that kind of feel like they're up here, and that kind of spacious awareness and transcendence and all of that. And the way that gets embodied really is as wholeness, as integration, and where we have an undivided sense of volition and an undivided mind. And so you could say that's where awakening or non-duality and therapy interact. And when a methodology where that fuses non-duality and therapy, and that's kind of the space that I work in, because I help people, spiritual people, resolve trauma and self-limiting patterns. When non-dual therapy is effective, this is the type of thing that it does, right? It has to get at that ontological level of being. When it does that successfully, then there's a shift that allows us to embody our awakening more deeply, and it allows us more space to even go deeper into realms of awakening that we haven't explored yet. Okay, so hope this has been really helpful and informative. Here, my contact info is also on you'll see it there in the notes on the YouTube video. Here's my contact info if you want to take any of that down. I hope this has been informative, and I really appreciate you tuning in. Thank you.